Yeah, I'm doing another one of these. I really want to, and I feel like it gives me something different to do every week, so I'm going to keep doing these. I understand that I may have gotten some criticism on the last one, but I'm not sure. All I sort of received was from a user, Nasi, please follow if you can, on Movellas, saying that they were terrified of reviews now, and I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm going to take it as a bit of both. I understand that the last video was probably really long, and I'm sorry about that. I will do better, and remember to keep this one, and this one is going to be a little more concise. This one's going to be on a poem, but I think to keep the other ones more concise, I'm probably going to end up putting a lot of timestamps in the description so that people can just jump ahead to the reading or to the review and they don't have to listen to me rambling for ages. So why did I suddenly change course? Originally I was going to do a review of another story. It was going to be Luke's story, or a different story, but it was Remembrance Day this Sunday, as well as Armistice Day, and it's the 100th year after the end of the First World War, so I thought it was important to do something based on the First World War. And what sort of solidified my sort of want to do that was that on Sunday I watched an amazing movie that was directed by Peter Jackson called They Will Not Grow Old, and anyone who's like into history or has a real interest in war or the First World War, or like holds Remembrance Day very close to their hearts, or it's very important to them, needs to watch this movie. And it was really, really eye-opening, and I'm not going to say more about it. I'm just going to say that it's amazing. Like, I have never been so moved by the telling of a story from the First World War. And I did a lot of, I was a literature student. I studied a lot about the First World War. I was also a history student. So I knew a fair bit, and it gets to me that war is so romanticized even in the sort of world that we live in now. So it was definitely eye-opening, and I encourage everyone to go and watch that. But having said that, I'm going to be doing a poem today because I honestly couldn't find anything else that was recently posted on Remembrance Sunday. And I'm going to be doing a poem by Eileen. As you can see, there isn't too much editing, and in her description of the novella, or the story, or the poem, she just wrote celebrating the 100th anniversary of the First World War. And like, I'm glad that I'm doing quite a short video today, because I think we need one after last week's, which was like over 30 minutes. But I'm gonna be like, I don't know how to do this. Like, I don't know if to just jump into it or talk a little bit about poetry, because I feel like a lot of people don't really understand what poetry is. Poetry for me, I have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with poetry, because it's something that's definitely been, it's one of the oldest forms of writing. It's existed forever. A lot of religious texts are written in like a poetic fashion. A lot of epics are written in poetic fashions, and they are considered poems. But when you think of a poem, you think of like a nursery rhyme with like 6 lines and it all rhymes. I think that's what generally everybody thinks when you say, oh, I wrote a poem. But there's loads of different kinds of poems, and back in the day they were very, very rigid and very, very structured, and more recently they're more freeform and they're more flowy, and they have, through the use of like word processors and things like that, we're able to make them more visual rather than focusing so much on like the rhyme and the rhythm and how many syllables you have per line and how the stanzas are formatted and things like that. And this is why I don't really want to criticize this too much, because I think that surpasses that. Like, war poetry was very much a thing. Wilfred Owen is a very famous British war poet, and he used to write poems that weren't necessarily rhythmically accurate. He after the First World War and the Second World War, it's called postmodernism, and in the postmodern era, you do find that the poetry is a lot more freeform, and you can see that reflected in his work. But I think the reason he sort of formatted his poetry like that was because it sort of reflects how incredibly like jarring war is, and how like confusing it is, and how out of structure everything is, despite the fact that the army and the military is very regimented, and you have to follow rules, and you have to do this and you have to do that, and I think that's very interesting. So I'm just, before I go on a whole rant about poetry, like I could talk all day about poetry, because like I said, I have a love and a hate relationship for it. There are some poems I absolutely disdain, and there are some poems that I absolutely love, and they all fall in different categories, but before I do that too much, I do want to read this so you can sort of see what Eileen has come up with. And it's very short, it's very sweet, and I think it portrays everything it needs to portray. So let's get to it. The poem is called Never Forget. One whole century I've lain here, seen rain and storms and skies so clear, and countless people come and go, the people come through rain and snow. Alone I watched, I've heard trees rustle, seen the blackbird's springtime bustle. I've lain here, stayed here, slept in bed, with 13 bullets in my head. A long time since I crouched in trenches, felt the wind through barbed wire fences, heard the cries of enemies and friends in death's serenity. For God, for faith, we fought the war, laid down our lives for some good cause, causes that we scarcely knew, for most of us were too young too. So now we're here in peace and calm, lying here does us no harm. Perhaps we may be long gone men, but our souls walk earth as they did then. And that's a poem. It's 5 stanzas. It's a fairly consistent rhyme, even though you have some half rhymes in there, and you definitely have like sibilance going on, which is like a repetition of the sound s or sh, which like reflects peace, and it reflects silence, and it's a very calm poem despite like what it's talking about. It's like, this is why I love poetry, because it, unlike a novel which you have to like read from cover to cover to understand what's going on, a poem sort of gives you everything you need to know very short and quickly, and it makes you feel something at the same time. And whether that feeling is good or bad, that is a reflection of art. Art isn't something that you just like and that everybody likes. Art is something that makes you feel something. It gives you an emotion to go off of. And I really appreciate that, and I hope that, my doing this helps Eileen get some popularity, because I don't know how many poems she's written, but this one definitely caught my attention on Remembrance Sunday, and I think it's, like, I understand that it's not important to everybody. A lot of people have different political views on it, whether or not they want to support the military or, whatever, but I think that the world wars, having them happen, like, they only ended 100 years ago, exactly 100 years ago, the First World War anyway, and it's just so important to understand the kind of world that was, like here in Britain, in France and Germany, where the wars were actually happening. It's very important to understand how quickly a world can turn from being very, placable and peaceful into like a complete nightmare. And like, that's what I take away from Remembrance Day. And I think that everyone can learn from a history like that. And you know, I feel like a lot of people will sort of simplify war and say things like today in where I work in a college, and one of the teachers sort of simplified it to the point where she showed a video about the day where the German soldiers and the English soldiers, or the two sides came onto no man's land to play football, and she was like, "Oh, I don't understand why the two went back to fighting the day after." And like she was sort of asking the class, like, why do we have to have war? Why do we have to fight? And I think like she simplified it to a point where it was like, well, it's not like a small dispute, it's a war between an entire world. That's why it was called a world war. And like when you sit and you think about it and you really sit with it, you understand it to be a lot more than just, oh, it's just something that happened in our history and it will never happen to us. It absolutely could. And we honestly cannot afford to be in a state of mind where we don't accept that as a reality, unfortunately. Like I don't get it. Like I'm a history student, so I think about it, well, not all the time, but I think about it fairly regularly. War is like one of the topics that I really find interesting because there's so much politics and so much nuance involved in why things happen and how things happen and how things turn out. But I think that a lot of people like to sweep that under the rug, and they like to romanticize things that really are quite devastating. Like when you hear the sounds of like those artillery like shells dropping on the on land and it like exploding into the air, like it terrifies me. But I think a lot of people look at it and think, oh well, we can't relate to that, so we're just going to reject it as something that's not important. But yeah, I'm getting to the point where I'm rambling now. I think I've spoken enough, and I hope you enjoyed this poem. And please do follow Eileen Prince. She's, I'm sure, very talented. I know she's quite new to the site, and I'm sure she would love some support and attention. And let's make Movellas great again. Let's make this community become a thing again, and let's support our new creators who are coming onto the platform to use it for the first time. And that is the only way that we can bring it back to being what it once was. So thank you guys for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope to do another one next week.